And for interest of full disclosure, I actually had the privilege and the honor to work with Wendy and for Wendy at USTR for several years on Japan. I learned everything about Japan through Wendy. So it's a great honor to be with her here today to talk about the U.S.-Japan economic and trade relationship. So as I said, a lot has happened in the year since we got together last time, the inaugural program. A lot of turbulence in the relationship between Japan and the U.S. and the rest of the world, to be honest. So, I'd like to start off by saying, what is your consensus on the overall state of affairs between the U.S.-Japan and this economic and trade relationship? Where are we currently in the relationship?
Well, I'd hate to break the news, but we're not done with tariffs. But first, I just want to say it's really my pleasure and honor to be here. I work for the Asia Society in Washington, D.C. I do travel extensively, including visiting our centers in the United States and all around Asia. And to be back in LA, one of my favorite centers of the Asia Society Network. It's really my pleasure to be here. And particularly thanks to Brian. He's been trying to get me here all year for this initiative, and we finally agreed upon a date. And so I have showed up, so hopefully we'll have a great conversation. And just Brian, he's so modest. I learned from him about Japan. He lived in Japan for many, many years. So I really valued all of his input and his expertise. And when he gave me notice that he was going to move to a different office at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, I remember trying to urge you to stay, and I think I even offered you a promotion, and you just said no. You moved to the Intellectual Property Office, yes, which probably has really served you well here in California. But again, I remember those days. So where are we in our relationship with Japan? And I'm going to focus on the economic side during this session. But before I do, let me just speak more generally. I think our relationship with Japan and our alliance it's solid, it's deep, it's extensive. It's not just government to government. It's not just leader to leader. There's so many roots and so much synergy and so many issues that we're working on together. So I'm very optimistic about our relationship. So now I've said something really positive. So that said, there are some serious underlying challenges now. And maybe I'll just mention a few. And these are things I've heard privately throughout Asia, but it's specifically from my colleagues in Tokyo. And that is, well, number one, that our president is very transactional, if you haven't noticed. And I think that there is a concern in Tokyo that that things that they counted on, the type of relationship that we've always had, some of it may be up for renegotiation or negotiation, including the security part of our relationship. So that's number one. Number two, just a lot of uncertainty and unpredictability. We've seen it on the trade front. We've seen it on other fronts of our relationship. So that's out there. And three, I would just say China. And what I hear from my colleagues in Tokyo is that there is a concern about where the U.S. is headed with China and how that will affect the U.S.-Japan relationship and their leadership in the Asia-Pacific region.
So that's kind of an overall overview of the relationship we are right now. Turning to trade, are we seeing Japan looking to diversify its trading partners as the U.S. Other trading partners have done?
Well, absolutely. And our trade relationship, too, has been pretty bumpy over the past year. During Trump's first term, he wasn't focused on imposing tariffs against our allies and partners. He really focused on China. But this time around, he has, gone after all of our allies and many of our close partners, not only in Asia, but in Latin America, Europe, and all around the world. And for Japan, I think this was a surprise. And the notion that we would raise tariffs against Japan, given the alliance we have, and also given the trade agreement that Japan concluded with Trump during his first term. And so a negotiation was underway last year. A deal was concluded. I think we'll get to more specifics about the deal. But I think the key is that we've raised tariffs against Japan. And I think that has really kind of been a challenge for the Japanese to kind of process and understand. But I think it has also led Japan, like other economies, to look to reduce their dependence on the United States and to negotiate with other countries. Because with less dependence on the United States, the feeling is Washington has less leverage over them when they get to the negotiating table. So Japan already has an extensive network of free trade agreements with a number of countries spanning from Mexico, Australia, the European Union, India, ASEAN countries. And they're looking to either update these agreements, build on them, but also to negotiate with more countries. Interestingly enough now, just in the past few weeks, Japan for the first time has indicated its interest in negotiating with the Mercosur countries in Latin America. And the reason I mention this is because you know what those countries produce? Agriculture. Mm-hmm. And that always kind of held back Japan in their international trade negotiations because of domestic concerns. But now, just the fact that they want to embark on these negotiations or in discussions to do that, I think it just shows how times have changed and that some of these agriculture concerns, while they're real, they're not as paramount and as concerning as some of the other challenges that Tokyo is experiencing. And also, Japan is a member of the CPTPP. Don't ask me now what that stands for. I know I negotiated TPP. We left that agreement when Trump came in during the first term. And guess what? And I would have never predicted this in a million years. Who stepped up to keep that agreement intact and to get it over the finish line? It was Japan. And Japan's still playing that role in CPTPP. So in many ways, Japan is really finding, its own way and trying to show leadership at a time, frankly, when, U.S. international engagement is going through some reassessment. That's pretty diplomatic, right?
That is very diplomatic. She's showing her years of experience. You've tempered yourself.
I wasn't like that at the negotiating table.
You've left some scarred. As I mentioned at the outset, a year ago, we were talking about tariffs, and as Wendy just mentioned a few minutes ago, we're still talking about tariffs. And as you probably, or you may not be aware, is that the U.S., after the Trump tariffs under the reciprocal tariffs under IEEPA were knocked down by the Supreme Court, they've now turned different statutes for new tariffs against Japan. And they launched two what are called Section 301 tariffs, one against importation of forced labor, and the other is for oversupply of the marketplace, the global marketplace. And Japan is named in both investigations. How is Japan reacting to that? I mean, they've gone through a year of a roller coaster ride of the IEEPA tariffs. Are they getting immune to these tariff investigations, or is this a new shockwave?
Yeah, and so it was just last week that the Washington announced that for Japan and 59 other countries, we would be imposing tariffs of somewhere, let's say 54 countries would get a tariff of 12.5%. The rest would get a tariff of 10%. That means Japan was in the smaller group. But basically, we're calling out countries for either not having laws and regulations on the books to deal with forced labor or not enforcing the commitments that they have. And Japan, like others, privately, some publicly, but not Japan, are very disappointed and frankly dismayed. and they feel like, why are they being named, particularly a country like Indonesia? Indonesia just concluded a trade agreement with the Trump administration, including forced labor provisions where they made significant concessions, and now they're being hit as well. And they feel like, well, wait a second, we did what you asked us to do. Why are you imposing tariffs on us? For Japan, I think that they have had private conversations with the administration and feel somewhat comfortable that the administration has basically given its word that even with new tariffs, that these tariffs will not exceed the ceiling of 15% that was agreed to in the deal they reached just last year with the administration. So as long as my sense is that tariff for Japan does not go above 15%, they're not going to be happy, but they'll accept it.
Mm-hmm. Besides tariffs and some of the other, the unpredictability that you mentioned of the current president, the transnational nature, we don't know what next day will bring. What are some of the other challenges you see to strengthening the economic ties with Japan and the U.S.?
Well, it's so interesting because, we have so much in common with Japan and so many kind of shared objectives, things we are working on. I don't want to say we're not. Issues like critical minerals, where China really has the chokehold and is using, showed its willingness to use that not only against the United States, but against Japan and others. We're working with Japan on shipbuilding. We're working with Japan on semiconductors. We're working with them on resilient supply chains. And this work is going on, but in my view, this should be the focus of what we're doing with Japan on the economic front versus, going back and forth with them on tariffs and trying to rebalance our trade deficit with Japan, which now in the good side is, somewhere between $60 billion and $65 billion. That's a lot, but again, it's been pretty stable, and there are real structural reasons for this imbalance. And let's not forget, and we'll probably get into this, Japanese companies, including Mitsui, have invested a lot in the United States. And under the deal they reached with under the deal that the Japanese government reached with the U.S. government last year, Japan committed to invest $550 billion in the United States by 2029. That is like a huge number. Let's just say they have a long way to go. Some projects have been announced. They're working closely with the Commerce Department to get these investments up and running. But again, there's just so much we can and should be working on, particularly in this kind of uncertain global world where supply chains are being disrupted on a daily basis for reasons we can't even anticipate.
We've talked about the Iran war and its effect on the global marketplaces, the supply chain, and the geopolitical alignments and so forth like that. And recently, the president has asked our allies, including Japan, to, for example, help open up the Strait of Hormuz. How has that affected the relationship? Is that, again, something that Japan can kind of brush off a little bit, or is that something that they're trying to engage in? I mean, we're requiring or demanding so much in terms of tariffs and other geopolitical alliances, and how is that affecting the relationship?
I think when it comes to the Mideast, where Japan gets about 90% of its oil from the region, gets some LNG, not as much from the region, and obviously there are a lot of other economic fallouts of other products that are being impacted by, by the conflict in the Middle East. Japan is trying to navigate its way through this with the United States. It doesn't want to be, actively siding with the United States, helping to keep the Strait of Hormuz open, because I'm sure it's worried about what that will mean for its partnerships in the region. At the same time, I think Japan does recognize that it needs to do more to not depend as much on the United States for security for security, and therefore I think it's really trying to kind of up its own capabilities. But again, I don't think Japan is unique here. I think a lot of our allies are trying to figure out how to work with the United States during this very difficult period in the Middle East.
You referenced the reciprocal trade agreement, or framework, some call it, that was negotiated and reached an agreement last year between Japan and the administration. What is the nature of the commitments in that agreement? When you were at USTR, you were, of course, the lead negotiator for TPP, as it used to be known as, and also the Chorus FTA. What is the nature of the commitments in this framework, and how does it differ from our conventional FTAs?
Yeah, so these Trump trade agreements there are a lot of differences between them and the ones that we negotiated, during the years. Number one, they're just a lot shorter, okay? I mean, some of them are like 2 pages. We used to negotiate agreements that went on for hundreds of pages and chapters on, all these different areas, which now are reduced to paragraphs. They're also vaguer. And we and Brian in particular, as a lawyer, I mean, you really appreciate the detail, because when the deals we negotiated had like dispute settlement provisions in the agreement, where if there was a dispute, you would have a panel would be established, and they would look at the agreement, look at the practice, and make a decision on whether the country was upholding or violating its commitments. And so you wanted details because you wanted the panel to feel like they could point to, paragraph 7, sentence 4, and say, you are not doing that. And these agreements are really vague, but they've no dispute settlement mechanism. And what does that mean? The U.S. will decide whether a country is living up to these commitments or not. And if we feel they're not now, we will either threaten or impose additional tariffs. So those are 2 differences. They're much more transactional, meaning like in the Japan deal, Japan committed to buy, I think it's like $8 billion of U.S. agriculture, energy, and planes and some other products. And it also agreed again on this huge investment commitment. So that's another, I think, difference. They also include, and this is important and I think a positive development, they include economic security provisions. And that's where I think these trade agreements are going, because the days of trade liberalization and multilateralism and efficiency, those days are over. People are much more concerned now about resilient supply chains, export controls, investment issues, et cetera. And so we are in these deals really focusing on those types of provisions, as well as provisions that are basically aimed at China. The word China doesn't appear in these agreements, but the way they are phrased, it's very clear that we are looking to work with our partners through these agreements and get them to make commitments which would harden their positions towards China and align more with the United States. And the jury is out on that one, because China is threatening those countries who have reached these deals with us and said, be very careful what you do, because if you uphold some of those commitments, we reserve our right to hit you or to retaliate against you and take countermeasures. So I don't know, that seems like the list of what's in these agreements. I mean, the other thing I would say is they're not rules-based. And so just to explain what that means. So let's just say in a deal, Japan agrees to buy, $5 billion more of U.S. agriculture. That is a time-limited commitment. Once you buy that agriculture, Japan could just go back and keep its market closed. But our view was you're better off with rules that will be durable and will change the practices of those countries so they will continue to buy our agriculture, for the foreseeable future. And, again, I think this transactional stuff, this is, our president likes big numbers. And I hear that, when some of our negotiators come home, he wants to know, like, how much, how much is that country going to buy from us? How much did it agree to invest? And then if he doesn't like those numbers and he wants them larger, either he picks up the phone or he sends the negotiators back to the table to get that number up. And that worries other countries because they feel that, these deals maybe aren't really durable. We can change the terms, we can threaten tariff hikes, we can add new tariffs, and they're kind of stuck with these commitments. And just one more comment is these agreements are largely one-sided, meaning the other countries make the commitments, we don't make any commitments. When we used to negotiate deals, not that we balance commitments 50-50, but the idea was that they were win-win agreements, and that the other country, also received concessions from us. And that was really important because when they go home, they have their own politics too. And, how are they going to sell the agreement at home? But now, like, Japan, Japan was selling the agreement. We dodged a bullet on agriculture. We didn't have to offer a lot. And we were able to get our auto tariff down from 25% to 15%. Those arguments worked in Tokyo and some other capitals of the world. They don't seem to be working that well. But that's just a very different philosophy.
Yeah. No, and going to your point, they're being one-sided. I mean, most of these agreements were under the threat of, oh, we'll just increase these tariffs unless you give us what we want.
Right.
Some other things to add to what Wendy said, too, is that these agreements are not legally binding. And in fact, conventional FTAs, again...
This is from a law professor.
And, there's a question of whether they're legal themselves. Just as the Supreme Court found, that the tariffs, the power to impose tariffs vests in Congress under the Constitution, so does the power to regulate foreign commerce. And the free trade agreements that we negotiated had to be approved by Congress, and they came with it. They were actually enacted as part of U.S. law. When you submit an FTA for approval, you have to also provide implementing legislation that enacts those FTAs into binding law. The U.S. are legally bound to honor its commitments. These agreements don't have that.
Yeah, all the years that I spent getting beat up by Congress, bringing these deals home, or kind of, saying, when we came home from each negotiating round, we'd have to go up to Congress and say, we got this, we didn't get that. Ira Kassoff's in the audience, he's smiling, he knows exactly what I'm talking about. And, it wasn't the most fun part of our job, would you agree?
Yes.
Yeah. And now, there's like no congressional and very little congressional oversight over these agreements. I'm not sure where Congress is right now, but again, the Constitution gives the authority on trade and tariffs to Congress, not to the administration. Although some of the powers have been delegated over time.
Well, the FTAs that are negotiated in the past, Congress delegated the authority to the executive branch, and that's not existed here. So, as you say, the durability of these agreements is very questionable. And what benefit or what incentive it is for the partner countries that agree to these agreements is to abide by them. It's an open question, I think. Given all that you've mentioned about the relationship, the ups and downs, can I ask you, are you still an optimist about the U.S. Japan economic relationship, both during the remainder of the Trump term and beyond?
Yes, I am, because again, like what I said in the beginning, and I really feel like this, our relationship is so deep, so extensive. There's ties between, so many different entities, whether it be universities or think tanks or businesses, but so many tie-ups between the two sides that go way beyond what the two governments are doing. But I do worry because I think there will be bumps in the road. Right now, the president seems to have a pretty good relationship with Prime Minister Takaichi. He on his first trip to Asia, he made a stop in Japan, and she visited the White House in March for a second meeting. I was impressed that the minute when he got on the plane leaving Beijing, who did he call? He called Takaichi from the plane, and I think that was the only leader, or at least publicly reported, that he did reach out to It wasn't a very long call, so I don't think he briefed her in any detail. But putting that aside, I think that does show that he even has a special, he recognizes there's a special relationship here, and that, we have a strong alliance with Tokyo.
Speaking of China, which we cannot ignore given the relationship and the role it has in the Asia-Pacific region and throughout the world, what impact do you have or see the recent meeting between Presidents Xi and Trump have on the U.S.-Japan relationship?
So I'm just back from China. I was there last week for a meeting with Chinese scholars and people from the party, and they were giving their kind of readout on this summit, which they believe was very successful. There may be up to 3 more meetings between Presidents Trump and Xi this year. President Trump has invited President Xi to Washington. I think it's September 24th.
That's right.
Yeah, is that right? Okay. And then China will be hosting APEC in November. The president's scheduled to go back to China for that meeting. And we are hosting the group called the G20, which is a group of the 20 largest economies in the world, in December, I believe in Florida. And President Xi is expected to attend. So, there are a lot of opportunities for both leaders to build on the meeting that they had just a few weeks ago. During this meeting, both sides emphasized the importance of stabilization in this relationship. And on one hand, our partners, including Japan, welcome stable U.S.-China relations. But yet, for Japan, it's a bit wary about this meeting and this relationship, and concerned that the U.S. may put more priority on China, kind of leaving Japan out there kind of alone, trying to kind of hold the region together. And it's no coincidence that Prime Minister Takaichi's been traveling all over Asia. She must be getting a lot of frequent flyer miles, because it seems she's, in every she's going all over trying to promote her vision of the Indo-Pacific. So, that's one impact. I think there is also a concern that the U.S. and China may cut tariffs with respect to certain products, and the Japanese may be concerned that this maybe could disadvantage them, although I kind of assure them that I think if the U.S. is going to cut tariffs on imports from China, they're going to be kind of very low, simple consumer goods, and not, nothing that, that Japan is interested in selling to the United States. But again, I think that there is a bit of a wariness here, and kind of, again, welcoming the stabilization, but worried about what, how far this might go, particularly at a time, and it's no secret, that China and Japan are experiencing, let's just say, a lot of strain and tension in their relationship that goes back now about a year, when Prime Minister Takaichi made some remarks on Taiwan that were not welcomed, again, I'm being the diplomat, by China. So that relationship is very tense right now. And I would say that one area to watch is the whole area of critical minerals. In Washington, everyone's talking about critical minerals and rare earths and magnets. And you go to meetings now and people start talking about the, gallium, germanium, and all these different ones. This is like, these inputs are critical for, for most products, and simple products, consumer products, but also defense products, and if China is dominant in this sector, not because it necessarily mines all these minerals, but it is the dominant processor and refiner of critical minerals. It has a chokehold on these products, and it has shown that it will restrict exports. And right now, it is restricting its exports to Japan, which is of grave concern. And I heard it was reported today that at least if Trump didn't raise this issue with Xi Jinping, at least Secretary Bessent, our Treasury Secretary, did raise it with his counterpart, asking China to basically free up some of those exports and start resuming their shipments to Japan. And I think that's a positive sign as well.
Yeah. Given that Japan and the U.S. share geopolitical concerns over China, both regionally and globally, do you think that our two countries will take advantage of this as a basis to strengthen our collaboration and cooperation in areas such as critical minerals that will also benefit our economic relationship?
I mean, absolutely. And we're already, again, I think we have one bilateral agreement with Japan on critical minerals. There's a bunch of what are called plurilateral initiatives that involve a handful of countries. And we're putting priority on that now. And I think what I'm optimistic about is that this is the one area, at least in the economic space, where this administration is willing to work with a group of countries together. Up until now, it's all been bilateral. And why? Because, that's where Trump thinks he has the most negotiating leverage. But when it comes to critical minerals, he's realized we can't do this alone. We need to work with countries around the world. And so this could be a model for other sectors, like, you hear the other choke point that people are talking about with respect to China is the whole area of pharma and bio, the whole biopharma area. And so maybe that, I've heard some people in the administration say that may be another area where we may, work with a group of countries. And from my perspective, like that's progress, okay? Because if we're going to deal with some of these really serious supply chain challenges and regional challenges and global challenges, we can't do it alone anymore, particularly when we try and compete against China. We need to be working with others, and we're doing that with Japan, and Japan's an excellent partner.
One final thought before we turn it over to the audience for questions, and that is, given your years of expertise and experience with the U.S.-Japan relationship, any words of advice to the U.S. government, to President Trump, or to Prime Minister Takaichi?
You kind of put me on the spot. Not that he would ever ask me for advice. She'd be more likely to ask me for advice. Again, I just think for both countries, and again, I think they both recognize that this is such an important relationship, and it spans so many different aspects and so many different pillars: security, economics, culture, cyber, all of these areas. And so, again, my advice would be, let's try and focus on those areas, those emerging areas where, that are really going to matter in terms of our competitiveness going forward. And, and this is where the president would never listen to me. And let's just forget about our bilateral trade deficit with Japan. We could do 20 more trade agreements, and I'm not sure we would even, we would significantly move the deficit.
Yeah. I think it's time for questions. So we'll go over to the floor. If you have a question, we call on you. Please say your name and your affiliation. Any questions? Dick, I gotta introduce your name.
Dick Drobnik, former chairman of Asia Society, Southern California. Wendy, you mentioned early on the trade agreement last year of U.S. Japan, and that the Japanese government was going to commit $590 billion, $550 billion of investment by 2029. The Japanese government doesn't invest. How is the Japanese government going to incentivize Japanese firms to do this? Forget the scale. That's never going to happen. But what was the concept behind that?
You can read this 10-page document. The Japanese government did take this commitment, and it's working hard with its companies, urging them to identify investment projects that they're interested, that the government then can take to the Commerce Department and work on. But the way this agreement is written, if you read the fine print, the U.S. also has the authority or the ability to ask Japan, say, we want an investment in this state for this sector. And so it's pretty a heavy-handed agreement. Again, a very big number. I thought you were going to ask me, did I think that, that this number would be reached by 2029? Given that, I think the investments announced so far are, some maybe they've reached $50 billion. I think the odds that this 550 target is ever going to be reached, not even 2029, but 2099, I'm pretty skeptical. But what I tell my Japanese friends is, even if you think this number is crazy and you're not happy about this agreement, and this is what I tell Japanese companies too, the key is just be on the right trajectory and keep announcing stuff. And one thing I think a lot of folks have learned, and I'm not sharing any secrets, it's easier to announce something, and sometimes Washington doesn't even remember if you follow through. So keep that in mind. But don't quote me.
Yes, Ira.
Thank you. Ira Kassoff from the board of the Asia Society here. Thank you very much for those comments. That was extremely interesting. You talked a little bit, Wendy, about tension between Japan and China. And I want to maybe ask you to talk a little more about that. What's going on between Japan and China? Are there high-level talks? Are they engaging in any way that you know of?
As far as I know, the relationship is bad and getting worse. I was just in China for some meetings, and the topic of Japan came up, and the pushback was just, at a tone that I've never heard before. So I think for China, it's no secret, Taiwan is their biggest red line. They repeat that, in every meeting, every hour. And I think they viewed Takaichi's comments last year as, just unacceptable. And, I think her efforts to send folks to Beijing and to try and lower the temperature, and also to try and ask U.S. support to lower the temperature, just haven't paid off thus far. So, when you ask if I'm optimistic in U.S. and Japan, I am. But Japan and China, I have a really hard time seeing how things get better for the foreseeable future. This isn't new for Japan. I think in 2010, there was a similar type of, strain in the relationship. And it took a new prime minister to basically reset the relationship. And sometimes that's easier, frankly, because, both sides have a way of then kind of moving on. But I'm concerned about this relationship. And again, these reports that China is holding back these critical minerals from Japan, that has got to be of grave concern to many Japanese companies who rely, even though Japan has done everything it can to reduce its dependence on China. When a country has, a 90% market share, even if you get it to 60, you're still 60% dependent on them. And I think Japan has done a better job because it was, it took steps much earlier than the United States to try and reduce this dependency. But, it takes time. And even for the U.S. now, all of the efforts we're making with countries all around the world to, and what we're doing domestically to mine more, to work with countries to develop processing capabilities, this is not going to happen overnight. And you ask people, experts, how long will this take before we're not dependent on China? And, we're talking, I think most experts will say 5 to 10 years. And China knows it has this leverage. And it was not willing to use that leverage against the United States until last year. And once it used the critical minerals card against the United States, our president had no option but to lower our tariffs. And I think that is going to really forestall him from raising tariffs against China going forward in any, beyond the level where it was last October.
Yes.
Hello, Gene Park from Loyola Marymount University. Thank you for your very insightful comments. You said once in today's comments the word Indo-Pacific, and I was just thinking about how not too long ago it would have come up so many times in a conversation about the region. And there was always an economic statecraft component and then a security component. And now that the U.S. has really kind of withdrawn from the economic aspect of that relationship, how would you think that the Japanese are thinking about approaching the Indo-Pacific strategy without the U.S. as an economic partner? And I also want to get your larger assessment about whether it's likely to be successful in the context of the U.S. kind of withdrawing. For example, in the first Obama administration, Indonesia, you mentioned, was seen as a key potential partner, and that seems like it's probably gone by the wayside with the kind of economic negotiations that they've gone through. So those are my points. Thanks. Questions?
So, my understanding is that Japan's kind of Indo-Pacific initiative now is really based on finding areas of cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners in more the economic security basket, right? So not just, they have trade agreements with ASEAN, with many, countries all over the region, but this is more about working with countries in areas like energy security, food security, critical minerals, supply chain resiliency, and there's a real appetite in the region as well, because many countries, particularly the Southeast Asian countries, they feel that they're really, caught between a rock and a hard place. They have the U.S. making demands on them, and then they have China making counter demands, and the phrase you always hear in Asia is, don't force us to choose. We are going, they don't say it like this, but we're going to hedge. And so they are trying to navigate through this relationship now, and they don't want to be viewed by China as being too pro-U.S. and vice versa. I mean, that's different for Japan. I'm talking now about Southeast Asia. But I think many of those countries have been subject to Chinese economic coercion in recent years. They recognize that it's not in their interest to be overly dependent on China, and so they're looking to diversify as well. And so my sense is that this Takaichi initiative is going over very well in the region. Now, does that mean that, a Japan-led initiative could be as successful as a US-led initiative? Time will tell. But things are changing. And I think, with all my travel in the Asia-Pacific region, I just get the sense more and more that, they value their relationship with the United States. They want access to our markets. They need the security relationship with the United States. But at the same time, they recognize things are changing here. And, I'd pass on just one comment, and I shared this at lunch with someone. And, when one Japanese colleague mentioned to me that he said when Trump came in his first term, they viewed that kind of as an aberration in U.S. Political system. And so when Biden came in and he wanted to strengthen all these alliances, and they were asked to do a lot, and we were all working together really well, Japan was all in. But now that the U.S. electorate has voted for Trump again and he's back, there is a feeling that even if the next U.S. president is more pro-alliance and wants to really up the game and all of that, their fear is what happens 4 years after that. And so I think that this diversification effort and these hedging efforts are going to continue, for the foreseeable future. And, again, things are just really, really changing in the region. And every trip I take, I'm just amazed. Not only, we haven't really talked about technology, I'm amazed about the innovation going on. But in some ways, I'm just feeling like maybe the U.S. is being left behind a bit, that we're not part of what's going on. And, we're so inwardly focused right now, and we're alienating, many of our partners. Again, privately, they'll tell you that. Publicly, they'll be, much more diplomatic. But I am concerned, and you know, I still bet on America, don't get me wrong, but there are things that I think we are doing that maybe make sense now and are supported by the American people internationally. I mean, by the American people, things we're doing on the international front. But I worry about the medium to long term as well, not just the immediate term.
Yeah.
But, you know, you say wrap up. That was a really pessimistic wrapping up. So, again, let's just go back to U.S. Japan.
Yeah.
Alliance strong, deep, beyond government to government. So, you know, events like this and initiatives like this are so important. And I really commend the center, and under Brian and Tom and Anjali's and Dick's leadership, you know, continue this, because I think programs like this and you know, promoting the strong ties between these two countries is really critical, particularly at this juncture.